Welcome to It's Not About the Money, a podcast in search of grounded fundraising. I'm Heather, and together with my co-host Andy, we look beyond the quick tips and formulas. Join us as we explore the nuance and complexity of ministry fundraising. If you want to thrive in partner development, not just survive it, this is the place for you.
Welcome back to the show, everyone. So glad that you're here. Today we are recapping the episode from Andy C. Such a rich time with him. One of the most prominent takeaways from the episode that we had with him was that God has established himself as the provider and has given us very clear instructions. Seek first the kingdom of God. We are free to pursue our own work unto him and to trust that he will provide what we need. There's certainly a very specific promise and example of God's provision for those doing the work of ministry. We see this in the Old Testament example of the Levites, and we see it all over the New Testament in the ways he provided through the community for the work of his apostles and the church. More generally, though, God has called all of his people to center their hope and dependence on him. It is helpful, though, to hold in tension the unique reality of support-based work and the universal reality that we all look to him for provision. It might feel tempting to think that it would be easier to, quote unquote, get a real job or have a guaranteed paycheck. A traditional job seems to carry a sense of security and certainty, but we would submit that what seems controllable is actually just a pretense. So we have with us Jeff and Kat. Heather, would you introduce our guests today?
I would love to. I have had the privilege of knowing each of them for over a decade now, and I've borne witness over and over to the Lord's work in their lives. And they're actually coming into this recap with a bit of a different perspective. Jeff and Kat are actually not currently in support-based ministry, but I think they have a really powerful story to tell about the Lord's provision and how he's called all of his people into looking to him and responding in obedience. And, you know, Andy, as you said, there really is a tension between the unique reality that people have in living in support-based work and just the reality that we are all, as God's children, called to look to him for our provision and to do what he says to do and to wait on him for that provision. Mm-hmm. And in some ways, I honestly feel like it can feel, I don't want to say easier, but maybe more normal to wait on the Lord's provision when you're in a position of ministry that's basically saying, well, yeah, that's how you get your funding.
Right. You have the expectation.
Yeah.
That this is how you do it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I feel like, man, there's just a lot of nuance in quote unquote, a real job when the reality is you actually are still depending on the Lord's provision, but it can feel a little bit more muddled with the agency you're supposed to take in making that happen, right? So I just think today's conversation will be really helpful to remind us that, man, whatever situation you're in, it is the Lord that is providing for you. And whether you're currently in a support-based role, the way that the Lord is forming you to depend on him isn't just something you'll need in that season. It's something that's forming you for an entire lifetime of looking to him on dependence, whether you're in support-based ministry or whether you move into an occupation that seems to provide a normal paycheck.
Right.
So that's a long intro. But like I said, Kat and Jeff are coming into this conversation with a really powerful testament to just seeing how kind the Lord is in providing, but feeling the tension of waiting on that provision. So with that, I'd love to pass it over to our guests and invite you to share anything you'd like before we get started.
Thank you, Heather.
Thanks, Heather. Yeah, I would say, first of all, I think we're both pretty flattered that you would think of us and give us the opportunity to share a little bit of this story. I think we also come into this with, just a weight of the importance of faithfully portraying what God's been doing in our lives. And so as scattered and muddled as our thoughts may be at times, hopefully we're able to, just faithfully articulate all that's been going on, because it's been an interesting journey the last couple of years.
Yeah. So, and this isn't a journey you've been on alone. You have some little people in your household, right? Tell us a little about your family.
Yep. So we have 3 boys, 9, 7, and 4, and they're very busy, but very fun.
I understand that. Yeah, great. So I guess to just get us started, one of the things we'd like to invite you to answer is, do you yourself have any experience in raising personal support, or do you have any experiences from being on the receiving end of being asked to partner with someone?
So I would say I have experience, I think early on. I did raise support for going to Bible school for a year. I think in my youth and immaturity, I did not have coaching or the skills to do that well, but the Lord still met me there. And I think part of that, seeing now, looking back at that story, I see how the Lord wanted me to really have my eyes fixed on Him through that whole year of studying abroad. And so I think that was part of the journey. And yet I think there was a lot to learn about how to steward those funds that came in well and to wait on the Lord. And then in addition to that, I have been in a faith-based nonprofit here in town for 11 years, and it is 100% donor supported. So we offer services to the community for free because people provide for that ministry. So I don't directly work with raising those funds or doing that development role, but I benefit from the support of the community.
And then on my side, I have a lot less experience with support raising. We do have experience, a lot of relationships with people who are involved in support-based ministries. Yeah, I mean, anyone who's vocational in their ministry is ultimately support-based. I love the reference to the Old Testament Levites and the way that God structured that. I think that's a pretty interesting topic to maybe discuss more at another time. But we, continue to have ongoing relationships with people that are in support-based roles. So,
Well, Heather, you know a lot about their story already, but this is the first time for me to hear it. So I'm really curious.
Yeah, so I'd love to just dive into allowing you guys to share a bit about your story and this journey that you've been on.
Yeah, it's almost an overwhelming question to try to answer at this point. And there's so much that we've lived through, that the Lord has brought us through, that we've been processing over really the last 3 or 4 years. There's been a shift in kind of our family and our story that in a lot of ways it centers around my work, which is our primary source of provision, or maybe the better way to say that is the primary channel that the Lord uses to provide for our family. And yeah, so I'm not sure how much of that story, honestly, to tell and how many of those details to go into. So maybe I can kind of provide more of an overview, and then we can kind of dive into more where it makes sense. But yeah, so actually, kind of right before the COVID pandemic, I had been with a company, more traditional, kind of corporate environment for about a decade. And that season of life came to a pretty abrupt end. I think both Kat and I knew that the Lord was moving us into something else. And I had kind of started to search for other jobs, other positions prior to that, but then, had hoped to be in a position to make the decision to leave. And I wasn't given that opportunity. Along with the COVID shutdowns came a round of layoffs, and I was let go. And so the Lord very clearly put us into a position that we didn't have control over. And I think that season really kicked off just a period of the Lord teaching us what it means to be just fully dependent on Him, that there is so much in this world that we don't have control over. And I think, for a season, I felt like my position in that company was secure. And I found out I was wrong in that. And that was a misplaced security. And so from that point on, we were in a position of really needing to rely on the Lord to help us chart a course forward in finding whatever was next for us. And really what He put in front of us were kind of two options. One was to continue down kind of the traditional path of job applications and looking through all of the listings that are out there and networking on LinkedIn and what have you, all of, maybe what I would call now kind of the world's tools, which there's nothing wrong necessarily with any of those things, But for us, the Lord kind of put a very clear question in front of us, which is which way do you want to go? Do you want to continue down this direction? And the other option that was in front of us was to kind of go more into a business partnership with a former coworker of mine and friend who we'd built a strong relationship with over the years, both professional and personal friendship based in a common faith. And so, yeah, it really became these kind of two things. Are you going to use kind of some imagery? Kat and I are both very imagery-based thinkers, and so you'll probably hear a lot of that today. But do we stay moored to the shore, if you will, in kind of the reliance on corporate structures and biweekly paychecks and things like that? Or do we go into this much less defined, much more uncertain direction of this consulting role in this partnership with this friend? And I think at that time, I used that moored to the shore imagery because being in a boat has been a big imagery component. And maybe I'll let Kat kind of tell a little bit about some of the initial conversations we had as we were trying to determine which direction to go, because we definitely have felt like we've been in a boat with the Lord the past couple of years.
And it seems like, even though you're talking about, two kind of business related options, I think a lot of the listeners can relate to that idea of being moored versus kind of uprooting yourself and going into something that's very much different. And
I think leading up to this fork in the road, the Lord had kind of been preparing our hearts in a lot of ways and renewing our faith in some really neat ways, showing us the importance of having margin and being available for disruption and being present, the importance of just abiding and listening. And I think when this period of waiting and trying to decide what was next, I know there was a lot of weight on Jeff to provide and to take care of us as a family unit. And so stepping out with his partner felt, I think, scarier out of the two options. But I think I started to hear, actually it came from another podcast I was listening to. And I think one of the speakers was talking about an experience where he was overseas and he was called to step into a boat and realized he had no control over the rudders and the sails. And he said that there are times when all of us encounter that experience. And it hit my heart. And I just remember just weeping, knowing that the Lord was speaking directly to us, that this was a moment where he was calling us into the boat and that we would have no control over the rudders or the sails. I didn't fully know what that meant, but I know some of the job opportunities that Jeff was pursuing that had more benefits and structure and was being tethered to the shore. And that this consulting opportunity was more stepping into the boat. Around the same time, Jeff had similar imagery that surfaced for him that I think was confirmation that the Lord was leading us in the same direction. Yeah,
separately, the Lord had kind of led me to the story of him walking on the water and Peter being in the boat with the disciples and being called out onto the water and stepping out of the boat. And so, separately, Kat and I had been having these sort of experiences and conversations with the Lord. And then, we're kind of coming together to talk a little bit about this decision that we had to make. And it was kind of funny because Kat came to me and she's like, I think, I've had this imagery and we need to get in the boat. And I was like, no, I think the Lord's really telling us to step out of the boat. And, I
was like, no, get in the boat.
Into the boat with no control of the rudder, the sails, or out of the boat onto away from what is secure and certain and into something that is fully reliant on the Lord.
And so we argued for a little bit and then realized we were arguing about the same call.
Yeah. Knowing a little bit about the nuance and the details as this story is unfolding, I'm just really grateful because, Kat, you said that you felt like the Lord had done a lot of renewing and a lot of clarifying and a lot of formation in you guys, kind of preparing you for this season. And I just want to call out, when Jeff says that they could have stayed moored to the shore, he had a very lucrative offer. I mean, Jeff had an offer from SpaceX. And I don't know if you are aware of the current world, but SpaceX is a pretty big deal.
We're going to Mars.
Yeah. So, I mean, Jeff by training is an engineer, and he had kind of what would look like an offer for a dream job. But I think because of the way the Lord had been forming your family, what looked like, wow, that's kind of a lot of what I would have hoped for, you actually could see what that would mean for family life and what that would mean for margin. And all of these ways that the Lord had been forming you, it actually formed you so well to be able to say, no, we know that's not what the Lord has for us. So
it's tough to walk away from.
Yeah. But I think he prepared them so kindly to walk away from that with confidence,
Well, I think it was harder for me to walk away from because the Lord had been working in Jeff's heart and he wanted to pursue the opportunity to see what that opportunity would be. But ultimately, I think he saw very clearly, if we can't have the family and the home life, and if I can't be around, if I can't have family and my career, then it's not a dream job.
Right.
And so he was able to see that the Lord had something greater. We just didn't know what. And so that kind of started us on this journey of, for the first 2 years of stepping into consulting, we had a client and the Lord continued to show up and confirm in powerful ways that he was with us and we needed to stay that course. And then he prepared Jeff and his partners to step away from that. And then we, for a year, were without another client.
Wow.
And so Jeff and his partner have been working for the last year to find the next client and to stay the course. And I think there's been a lot of stop and stall and wait and in that journey. But the Lord has also been very present, which has been sweet. And I think that's what's beautiful about, what Andy talks about is that tangible experience of leaning into the Lord and experiencing him in a powerful way. Because in the same way, had we known what we had said yes to when we said yes to what the Lord had called us into, I don't know if we would have felt we were equipped or had the strength to do it. But he's been so powerfully present and so faithful. So
I think it's so important to consider like the full arc of a narrative. Like even if we were to let's go back to that familiar Elijah passage where he has to go to the widow and God provides miraculously. Like that was probably a stretch for both of them. And I think we can have like a stunted view of how it works and how he provides if we just stop there. But the story continues and it's not all like roses and sunshine. The boy dies. And then, of course, Elijah prays for him and then he comes back to life. But, so it ends up okay, but it doesn't mean there's not bumps.
And disruption.
Yeah, in the road.
Yeah. And, I guess the passage that comes to mind is that, without faith, it's impossible to please God. And so what God's really looking for is, Heather, you talk a lot about formation, but what he's really looking for is faith to be fully formed in us. And that trust is so complete that we would trust him through job loss, through failure, through lack of what might appear on the face to be lack of provision. Trust him through death in the case of the story with Elijah.
Yeah.
But ultimately that's what complete reliance and a fully formed faith looks like. And that's the work that his Spirit is about. That's what he's trying to do in us.
Yeah. Well, I want to pull on one thread too that was highlighted as you were talking about the boat scenario and discussing what you should do in the boat. You stay in it and weather the storm or get out. Like what you said was it was terrifying, right? So I think there's this misconception that, if the Lord wants me to do something, he's going to give me a sense of peace. And so sometimes I think we in the church use that as an excuse, like, I didn't have peace about this, and so I'm not going to do it. But sometimes God asks you to do things that are absolutely terrifying.
Yeah, almost like we have created an attachment with like the Lord's peace and comfort, or the Lord's peace and
his will for us.
Yeah, and a felt sense of ease. Whereas, is it possible that you can have the peace of the Lord and still feel uncomfortable? Just something interesting to think about. And
the peace comes eventually. I mean, Jesus gets in the boat and then calms the storm.
And I've actually heard, Jeff and Kat, you guys, there's yet another boat story and yet another storm that has kind of been a meaningful piece of imagery for you guys when the disciples are on the boat and Jesus is sleeping. I'd love to hear a little about how that has played into this season.
I think any time the boat imagery would come up, either in sermons or in teachings, the Lord had our attention. And so I think it was definitely some language that the Lord used to speak to our hearts. And I think one of the other ones that would come up similarly was the disciples, Jesus asleep in the boat in the midst of a storm. And I think for me, and Jeff, you can speak to how this has spoken to you differently, but we had talked a lot about that story in the Gospels and about how the Lord, comes to the disciples after they wake him in fear and say, "You're going, we're dying," and he calms the storm, which I think is so powerful for them to observe. And in the Lord's grace, in the midst of their fear, they get to see his power. But we've talked many times about what would it look like if the disciples had had the faith that Jesus said that they had lacked. And I think as I've continued to grow in my faith, I think I look at the way that Jesus responds to people, and I start to see that so much of the way he speaks is from a place of love, not condemnation. So I don't think he was coming to the disciples and saying, you didn't have it. You weren't enough. You failed me.
Yeah.
But it was more of a, if you would believe in what I'm truly capable of, then you wouldn't have doubted. And I think we've talked a lot about that there's such a grace in that and a love for us to want us to know and believe more of him, to keep our eyes on him, to remember who's in the boat with us. And if we knew the power that was present with us, then the storm would seem so minimal compared to his might. But we've also talked about what it would look like if they had had that faith. And honestly, I don't know if the Lord would have calmed the storm if they had had the faith they needed, because I think the Lord knows we live in an imperfect and fallen world. But I do think that there is an internal calm that comes from trusting and having confidence in him. I know that in this year of waiting, we strangely felt, it ebbed and flowed. There were moments of fear and questions and
anxiety and
But for the most part, we continued to feel his confirmation that we were where we were supposed to be and we needed to settle into the boat. But I think I also look at them and I see these men were all men who, a lot of them were fishermen, professional fishermen. They were very familiar with storms. They were familiar with the boat. And I think there's something beautiful about that we're not just called to wait and do nothing, that even in the midst of the storm, I don't think they would have watched a flapping sail and been, allowed that to destroy the boat or cause more harm. I think naturally they would have taken their skills and their knowledge, and they would have maintained or worked the boat, but had an internal confidence that the outcomes were the Lord's. But what they were called to now was to manage
keep
the
it
storm
from capsizing,
right? And to support each other. And so I think there is a lot to learn there as far as just in the moment keeping our eyes on who's with us and knowing that he has he's hit the outcomes are his. But here today, we can control where our faith lies. And there's grace when we fall short, and he shows up powerfully to show us his might. But
there's so much in that passage. A couple of things I want to note is, just the Lord's grace and kindness towards us, whether we get it right or get it wrong. I think I've honed in on just a little detail in that passage where, they wake Jesus and, say, "Lord, we're perishing, save us." And I think a lot of people, myself included in the past, took his statement, "Oh, you have little faith," as a rebuke. But Scripture actually says he rebuked the waves and the wind, and then he turned to the disciples and said, "You have little faith." And I think it's so interesting that the rebuke happened against the chaos and the turmoil. And then if you can imagine the Lord, getting that rebuke out of the way and then turning to his disciples in love and saying, "Oh, you have little faith. Like, don't you know who's with you?" And that's God's heart, is to, again, kind of form that faith in us, that's what he's after. And it's a loving invitation, not a rebuke. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think that's kind of a beautiful thing, that, in seasons of turmoil and difficulty and, our own fears getting the best of us, that's the heart of the Lord towards us is, he's not happy about this chaotic, sinful world that we're having to deal with either, but he's most interested in growing that faith within us, and demonstrating that he is trustworthy. I think there, is a scripture that's been on my heart for a number of years. I think it's Psalm 86, and it says, or from Psalm 86, I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but it says, "Teach me your way, O Lord, that I may rely on your faithfulness." And that's so much of what that picture of the boat is the Lord is taking that opportunity to teach them his ways, so that in the future they would be able to rely on his faithfulness. And I think that's been, in a lot of ways, that scripture has been unintentionally, I guess, a prayer in my heart, that the Lord would teach me his ways, that I would rely on his faithfulness, because his way is trustworthy. His way is provision. His way is complete and utter faithfulness. We just need to learn it so that we can rely on it.
What stands out to me as I listen to you is that you're talking about a very tumultuous season in your life very calmly at this point, but it's all kind of like hindsight. So, I mean, there could be people that are listening now that are in the midst of all this turmoil.
For sure.
But these are probably things that you know that God is good. You know that he provides for you at a head level, but you've experienced it in a different way, having gone through all this.
Yeah, I think in the moment, oftentimes, at least for me, it can almost feel like foolishness. Like this, like trusting in you, Lord. It's before he's taught you his ways, right? You haven't learned to rely on that yet, and so there is that question: like, are you really who you say you are?
Your flesh revolts against that level of trust.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Are you really trustworthy? And am I a fool for creating space for you to demonstrate that to me? And I think that's really another big piece that I think it's stuck out to me with the story of Peter stepping out onto the waves. It is Peter created space for the Lord to demonstrate who he is in a powerful and new way, right? He had never seen any human walk on the waves before. The only thing he'd seen is the Lord in front of him. And he didn't even necessarily believe that was Jesus. He said, "Lord, if that's really then tell me to come out."
Yeah.
And I
He
will.
initiated that. Yeah.
Yeah. But what I think is important to note there is he didn't just jump into the ocean without the Lord's call.
Sure.
Right. The Lord, he said, "If that's really you, then call me." And then Jesus called to him and he stepped out. And, I think any objective viewer at that point in time would say, "What a fool. You're stepping out of a perfectly good boat in a storm."
Probably the rest of his friends were like, "What are you doing?
What are you doing? Right. That's foolish." But it's only foolish if it's not the call of the Lord. And if it's the call of the Lord, then it is completely trustworthy.
Yeah. Well, and I would say, to answer your question, I think one of the things in the moment that we ebbed and flowed with and that we learned in waiting for the Lord is that we would start to see movement and see what the Lord was doing. And I would start to write the story of how that was all going to play out. And then the Lord would halt things. And I think my peace would get rocked. And I'd be like, are we hearing you correctly? Are we is
the widow's son dies? Right? Did we hear you, Lord?
You're following the narrative, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think the Lord had taught or was starting to teach us that that was never my story. I'm the author, not you. And so we started to get to a place where we said over and over again, don't write the story. We don't know how this is going to play out. We don't even know what he's doing behind the veil, what we're waiting on, and there would be times where he'd like pull the veil back and we'd see that he's working in like other people's lives to line them up. He's working in, I mean, there's, people that Jeff and his partner have recently hired who needed to be in a place where they could leave their job and say yes to the Lord to join them. And honestly, we are only a couple paychecks into receiving his provision. So this is all still very fresh. And there's still a lot more where we're realizing that the Lord is not suddenly going to release us to gain all this control back, that we are called to surrender, to yield for the rest of our lives. And so this like tension of trust and relying on his provision, like just because this year of waiting for a paycheck has stopped, there is so much more that we still need to yield and hold loosely and trust him with.
Yeah, that brings up two things for me. The first is just pointing out, for all our listeners, the narrative arc is never the same. I think there can sometimes be comparison or looking at others thinking, they've done these things and they've been able to stay on support and they've not had major disruption. Are we doing something wrong? Or maybe you're the person that's been on consistent support. You've never had disruption. And so you think you've got the way or whatever. But I think it's just from your story important, Kat, when you said, I saw and then started to write the story, I think it's just important to remember the Lord's provision. There's not like a formulaic arc that he has, right? It's not like everybody's arc is he calls you to provide, he provides a little, and then there's disaster, and then he provides more.
Yeah. And when you really think about it, none of us really want that kind of Hallmark movie predictability.
Yeah.
I feel like.
But we kind of do.
Kind of we do. But
we kind of want to be able to
right?
We kind of want to like go through our disruption and then kind of coast into ease or
God knows we need more than that.
But he tethers us to himself for the long haul and depending on his faithfulness, right, attaching us to the security of that. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is just, if I might speak from being somebody that's watched you guys, Andy, you remarked that you're talking about this so calmly. And I've had the opportunity to walk through this past year with Jeff and Kat. And I would say, as Jeff said, they haven't been unfazed, but they've been faithful. And I know many people in this season have been in all kinds of great intentions, pointing Jeff to
helpful.
Pointing Jeff business opportunities that fit his skill set. I'm pretty sure I sent him a job description for a company I work for and said, you'd be great at this. And I'm only mentioning that to say, Jeff said, he doesn't call everyone to step out of the boat. Or, when you were talking about Peter, you said he called Peter out of the boat. It's not that like everybody needs to get out of the boat. Like faithfulness looks like getting out of the boat, but he called him to. And I think something that's just been so clear in their story is their unwavering commitment to like letting the Spirit lead them on level paths. I think that, I don't remember if that's in Psalm 86 or not, and just, even though they're not unfazed, like, oh gosh, Lord, am I foolish? Am I doing this? But they haven't veered from what they know faithfulness to be in waiting on him.
Yeah, I think there's been a lot of learning, a lot of teaching. God's been doing a lot of teaching in that sense. One of the quotes from Andy's podcast that has stuck with me is the Hudson Taylor quote that God's work done in God's way will never lack God's supply. And there's so much richness to that. But what's kind of stuck out to me is, a lot of times it can be pretty clear to us what God's work is and what God's supply could or should look like. Right? But God's way is the gray part in that quote. And that's really where the abiding in him needs to play a key role. And for us, the way that I've been thinking about it, one of the things that God's been teaching me is just a new understanding of what it means to take Christ's yoke upon us. And that passage that is supposed to be so comforting, that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. But that's so hard to find, I think, sometimes in this life. And I won't claim that I've found that consistently, but I have found that at times. And what that, I think, means to me today is, again, the imagery of that is really powerful to me. That the yoke isn't, if you think about what a yoke is, it's a tool that links two oxen together, right? The yoke itself is not the burden. The burden is what's being pulled behind a cart or a plow or something, right?
Yeah.
But what the yoke serves to do is it serves to keep the animals next to each other and moving together at the same speed. And so to now take that metaphorically in our relationship with Christ, it's our job in taking Christ's yoke upon us. It's really, it kind of parallels abiding in the vine. It's kind of the same thing. It's staying connected to Jesus so that we can understand his direction and go at his pace. And I think the pace is the other piece of it. So often when we're writing the story, we get one of those two things wrong. We either think God's taking us in this direction, and so we start to run that way, right? And then get disappointed when that door closes or something. Or we have the direction right, but we expect it to play out at a certain speed, right? To go quicker, or whether it's, if you're raising support for provision, to come in at a certain pace or to meet a certain deadline or what have you. And sometimes the Lord's timing, his pace, the way he's moving is different. That doesn't mean he's not going to provide. He will, but it might be on a different timeline or in a different direction than we anticipated.
Yeah, I think we see that a lot. Yeah, as we're coaching people, the trajectory, the pace, it's quite different. Yeah, from person to person.
Yeah. And there can be a lot of beauty in the disruption as you look back on it, right? Like, we have a friend that just launched into her country of service after, 8 years of working towards funding.
Yeah.
And now she's there. And I'm just so confident it's not like the Lord messed up in those 8 years. It's not like he missed his chance to get her there when he really wanted her to be there.
Right.
Yeah. So there's purpose.
We should have her on the show too.
We're working on it. I think this might be a great point for us to transition to looking more directly at the episode. Thank you so much for being willing to share your experience and your story.
Yeah. And
with that kind of in the background, we can now dive into what we heard Andy C. say.
Well, I think immediately the takeaway for me after just coming off of this conversation is that, again, the Lord works differently in different scenarios. So just because Andy C. has 700 people on his mailing list and has been doing this for 30 years and never really had to have a sit down conversation with somebody where he invited them into partnership, like it all just kind of fell into place. You can kind of get that feeling like that doesn't work for everybody. It doesn't mean it's always going to work, and that if God doesn't do that, then that's a sign of his disapproval or his guiding you somewhere else.
I think speaking to the 700 supporters, I think that was impactful to me too, because he spoke so much about being called into relationship and into discipleship, and that he saw those supporters as a part of that ministry. I thought that was so beautiful. And he also was very aware that the provision was the Lord's. And so I think he, for the most part, it sounds like really didn't focus on the details of or the outcomes but yet he still talked about stewardship and responsibility. And I think, towards the end of the episode, he talks about the structures that he put into place to do that well, to steward those people well. And I think, once again, it just is such a picture of a professional fisherman in the light of like the call, the ministry, the journey. And I'm sure there were storms in the midst of building those relationships and investing in those people, maybe being sometimes misunderstood or, feeling misrepresented or even conflict or whatever that looks like. I know that wasn't always easy to navigate relationship and to invite people into ministry and casting vision. And yet he like just talks about the stewardship and the ownership of like having the structure to be able to do that well, and leaning into his family's strengths. I love how he talked about how he acknowledged that there were strengths that he had and there were different strengths that his wife had. And so, like yielding to one another so that they could be a stronger team to do that call well, I thought was really beautiful.
I really loved the attunement it showed towards their supporters when he referenced that there was a season where their provision was abundant and maybe even more than what was necessarily quote unquote needed. And that in that season, they approached different people that were partnering with them to just say, hey, we're aware that this season might be a season where you retaining those funds might be more beneficial. Yeah. So we would like to invite you to pray about that and to feel like no pressure on our end. And I really appreciated the level to which they were aware of their partners and willing to work for their good in that. I thought that was really beautiful.
I think it can be easy when you're on the field to really be focused on your core objectives. Like, I need to have this many spiritual conversations. I need to disciple this many people. And that's great. But I think your ministry, as he brought out, is broader than that. Like, it is to the local people. It's to the believers and non-believers. It's to your teammates, your coworkers, but it's also to the sending community back home that mobilized you. Like, that's a huge part of your ministry too.
Yeah, I that was one of my takeaways as well, that, one of his statements was that we're not called to raise money, we're called to raise people.
Right.
And that's so much broader than just the laser focused mission field.
Right.
That's all of the relationships around us. So in that sense, to just say it very frankly, we're called to minister equally to both the supporters and the community that you're sent to, and your family, and all of these things that I think about it kind of in the terms of, what is this little kingdom that God has called me to be responsible for, right? And that I have a call and a responsibility to steward that little kingdom in a way that honors the Lord and honors all of the people that are present within that. And I think that's true whether we're called into a specific ministry field, or whether we're in vocational ministry, or whether we're more of the layperson just going and doing a job every day. The call doesn't change there. We all have people around us who the Lord has placed with intention for us to draw deeper into relationship with Him. I think that there's, again, back to our imagery, one of the key ways that the Lord speaks to us. But so Heather mentioned my background is engineering. I don't know, it was probably a year and a half ago or something like this, where I was kind of pondering this concept of our call as, just an average couple to minister to those around us. And the Lord gave me this interesting vision from, really from an engineering textbook. So buckle up. This is, if you haven't slept in a while, this might help.
This might,
But
perfect.
And one of the classes I took is fluid mechanics, and we learned about how fluids flow, right? And one of the things you learn is that, say, in a pipe or whatever, the flow is always the fastest at the center. And then as you get closer to the edge or the wall, the fluid slows down to a stop. And the parallel there is this idea that there's this, the Spirit is flowing through this life, through the earth, like a river, this river of life, right? And that the Spirit is at the center of that. He's the one that's moving at His speed, right? And the goal, we're all water molecules somewhere in this river, or maybe some of us haven't even jumped in, we're on the shore, right? But that, closer to the edge, further away from the Spirit, the flow is very slow and stagnant, or even there might be even little eddies, circling back and going the wrong direction, right? But as you get closer and closer to the center, you're more and more aligned with the Lord and His movement. And us as little water molecules, we don't get to minister to everybody, but there is a core group of people that have been placed around us. And our job is to just draw those around us further and further in to the Lord in relationship with him and into the Spirit. And in doing that, become more a part of his movement in the world. It's again, kind of related to the concept of abiding, but apart from him, we can do nothing, but in him, we harness the power of his Spirit and of his movement. And it's in that we're able to bear fruit.
And water that isn't moving is stagnant.
Yeah.
And that's where nobody wants to drink that. That's disgusting.
Well, and the beautiful piece is if we just draw people that we are near or encountering or who's directly in front of us just through relationship and through being, sharing our story and being an ambassadors to Christ. Like we draw them in by, just rubbing up against them in life, like encountering them. We don't know who they're going to encounter and who they're going to encounter. And it's like the Lord, his impact is so much greater. And all we have to focus on is who have you put in front of me? Who do I get to share the truth of who the Lord is? And, it's where our heart is, there our treasure is also. And so the provision comes from connecting with people's hearts. And I feel like that's just what Andy says his mission is to share his heart. And in that, people naturally want to jump in and put their treasure where their heart is,
Yeah, people are never excited about just kind of covering expenses. Or like, well, how much can I give you to cover your insurance? Like those are real needs, but people are excited about the vision that they're participating in. So I love that he shifted the focus back towards take it off of the money. And like, it's not about the money. It's about the vision that you're trying to cast. And for him, I feel like that just kind of comes out of who he is. So it's very authentic. Yeah, I know we're already getting pretty long here, but I just want to highlight his thinking about inertia.
Yes.
The idea that to get a plane off the ground, to move it from here to there, it takes a lot of work. It takes a lot of effort up front. And so I think there can be some mistakes or some confusion when we think that, wow, fundraising is really rough. It's always going to be like this. I'm always going to have to pour this much into it. But he said, like, after a while, it was kind of like not autopilot, but it took a lot less effort to kind of keep things moving forward. And I think that can go positive or negative. I think you have negative inertia. Like when you're first getting started, you can have this tendency to just kind of postpone, to procrastinate. And that can really take a lot to get you off the ground and to get started. But once you do, I think of my friend who has a Tesla. Coming back to the Musk universe here, he was extolling the autopilot, like the auto drive feature, and like how he can just get on the freeway and it does all the braking for him. But every once in a while, it'll say, put your hands back on the wheel, and you need to touch this and kind of take control a little bit again. So I think that's a good picture. Like it's not always going to be super, super hard. Like you'll find rhythms, you'll find things that work. People aren't always going to need the same level of communication. You have to be faithful, of course, but that was just a helpful perspective.
Yeah.
I thought,
And I think just to tease out a little bit more nuance in that example, I think that there are some like standard practices, skills, necessary elements to get a plane off the ground.
Right.
And there are some standard, best practice ways that you keep a plane flying smoothly.
Right.
But every flight is different.
Turbulence.
Yeah, turbulence or a storm or a rogue bird that goes into your propeller. Like, we're probably getting a little bit too down the hole of this analogy. But just to point out again, there are some really great skills. There are some best practices. There are even some like truths about what God has told us about walking in wisdom and stewardship. There's all these things that are important and necessary, but do not entitle you to a specific outcome and don't guarantee that it's going to be smooth and without disruption. And it's just so important to remember that, because then when you hit disruption, hopefully it can help you from going to that place where you're quick to call yourself a fool, or you're quick to doubt that the Lord is going to do what he said, or that he's good. I mean, I think I'm just trying to encourage us that, like Kat said, when we feel like there's a specific way this needs to turn out, or there's a specific way we see God's provision coming, that kind of attachment to a specific need or idea or outcome is what can really rob our peace. Whereas secure attachment to the Lord's faithfulness just leaves a lot of freedom for him to do with that what he's going to.
I'd also say, I think in the same way that it's important not to write the story ahead of God, I love that Andy talks about how important it is to reflect on the story he has written. And he talks about that annual prayer and planning time as a couple. And he said, looking back over the years helps to stimulate further obedience because of his past faithfulness. And I think we so easily forget what the Lord is doing or what he's done. And I think to stay the course requires us to remember the path we've had to take with him and what he's done. So,
yeah, and just taking time to acknowledge his hand and the way he's been at work is key.
Yeah, we're so stuck in the moment so often, right? In our current whatever's in front of us. It's hard sometimes to think about the future and make goals and plan, but it's also hard to remember what he's already done. Yeah, we need to be conscious of all that stuff.
It's a classic human problem, right? It's, Israel coming out of Egypt, they see the parting of the Red Seas, and then they get into the desert and they're faced with a new problem, right? It's, lack of food or water or whatever. The setting of festivals and whatever in Scripture for that purpose of remembering. Somehow, we deal with those same human pitfalls and need to address those same things in our lives.
Yeah, here I raise my Ebenezer, right? That let's build that.
That's right. Yeah,
build that to remember.
But I think in recognizing like, man, this is the same problem playing out over and over. It's just so good to go back to what you kind of said towards the beginning of our time together with like the Lord's heart towards us. And it's not a rebuking like, why can't you guys get it? But it's like a continual invitation into his rest. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for being willing to share your story and talk through this episode with us. I guess just knowing that most of our listeners are going to be people that are either raising personal support for ministry or living and working in support-based ministry. I'd love to know if you guys have any encouragement that you would want to pass along.
I guess I would just go back to what Andy said. He said if he had known he'd be called to 30 years of support-based ministry, he wouldn't have started. Although if he had known then what he knows now, he would have run into it. And I think that that's maybe the promise, is that the Lord is good and he is going to show himself faithful. And we just have to be looking to him and staying present and in step with him.
It's a good word. And listener, do you believe that?
From your opportunity to sit with people asking for partnership, is there any way you would encourage people as they approach those conversations?
I think in light of that question, I think he said, talking about Elijah and the widow, he said, do you believe God, or are you robbing them, the people that you are called to talk to, the opportunity to experience God by not asking? And how powerful like that statement is. I think sometimes we can fear the call to ask for support because so much of our treasure is attached to our heart. We're very we hold it, we protect it. And so sometimes it can be hard to ask somebody to give, so much of themselves, so much of the things they value to what we value. But sometimes we don't see it as a robbing them of an opportunity of experiencing God. But
yeah, because the reality is that everybody in the world has limited resources, right? Limited funds, limited monthly budgets, and so what you are asking for is a sacrifice on their part. But you're inviting them to take that step of faith. Really, you're inviting them to an opportunity for the Lord to build faith in them, to teach them his ways and his faithfulness by making a decision to invest in the ministry that he's called you into. And ultimately that decision is not your responsibility. That's between them and the Lord. But if the Lord is calling them out on those waves, what an incredible opportunity for him to show his faithfulness to them through giving and through stepping out in faith.
Yes, absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for your time. And listeners, thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Heather. Thanks, Andy.
Yeah.
Thank you, listeners. See you later.
It's Not About the Money is presented by Provisio Fundraising Solutions. Provisio equips support-based workers with flexible training, practical resources, and one-on-one coaching. Find out more at provisiofundraising.com.